Hello. Today we're going to be talking about some of the basics of Azure and just giving ourselves a baseline for exactly what Azure is and how we can use it to make our businesses a little more efficient. So obviously the first thing that we're going to want to set a baseline for is exactly what Microsoft Azure actually is. So to start with, Azure is Microsoft's cloud computing platform. So if you've watched our previous videos on virtualization, cloud computing is kind of the next step for that. Just by way of a quick recap, virtualization is the process by which, rather than having tens or dozens of servers that are all filling a very specific role, virtualization allows you to basically collapse all of those physical servers down onto just a handful of larger servers that allow you to gain some scalability and performance benefits versus having multiple separate physical servers. Well, what cloud computing allows for is using virtualization as sort of the base. Cloud computing allows you to deliver those same services basically fully over the internet. The basic idea here is that with virtualization, you still have to purchase and manage and upgrade your physical server architecture because you have physical servers that are sitting in a server room. Cloud computing is basically you have rented or owned space in a cloud environment that you connect to via an existing business internet connection. So cloud is basically you've got where you go from having 2 or 3 large virtualization servers to basically no physical servers in your environment, and all of them are virtually hosted by a cloud provider. Microsoft is, or more specifically, Microsoft Azure is one such example of this cloud computing functionality. Just like with virtualization, cloud computing has compatibility across a number of different technologies, not the least of which would be something like Python or .NET, and you can also use cloud computing or you can add cloud computing to your existing Windows or Linux infrastructure. On top of just the sort of operating system level compatibility, one of the major benefits of the cloud computing platform is the ability for the software or for the service that you're virtualizing to basically be highly resilient, because rather than having them simply listed or hosted inside of a physical local data center, cloud computing very often runs global data centers where redundancy and resiliency can be managed at a much wider scale. Now, when it comes to the different components that go into a cloud computing environment, there are obviously a couple of basic items to briefly touch on. The first and most basic one is what I've basically just run through, the idea that your cloud computing infrastructure can replace existing on-premise physical infrastructure, whether we're talking about actual physical servers or the underlying networking infrastructure. Cloud computing can be used to replace or to bolster some of that existing infrastructure. Additionally, many cloud computing vendors, again, Azure is one, AWS is another very popular one, they also offer something called infrastructure as a service, which is basically the idea of having your different layer 2, layer 3 technologies, switches and routers, all provided through a virtual infrastructure. You can also do something called platform as a service, which is basically the ability to create a platform, which could include actual operating systems or virtual machines, as well as the accompanying networking that is needed for those particular services, all in one big package. And the last one that's not quite as readily apparent is that with software as a service or SaaS implementations, cloud computing can make implementing software as a service or utilizing software as a service a little bit more budget friendly than going out and physically purchasing the underlying equipment that is needed to test software. Another very popular aspect, particularly of Microsoft Azure, is its ability to basically run two different pricing models. The most straightforward one is basically a pay-as-you-go option, which is if you only need this hardware for a limited period of time, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, rather than being put into a position where you have to go out and physically purchase the hardware and the software that you need to test your new piece of code. Using a pay-as-you-go model in a cloud computing environment can be much cheaper long-term than going out and having to spend thousands or tens of thousands of dollars on the actual physical infrastructure that you need just to test one piece of code. Similarly, or as the counterpoint to that, if you do have regular need for servers, infrastructure, and so on, you can actually purchase much longer support agreements that cover blocks of months or potentially years. And importantly, one of the things that cloud computing, through some of the virtualization technology, enables is the ability to scale up or scale down dynamically. So rather than being put into a position where you go out and spend thousands or tens of thousands of dollars on physical hardware that may only need that maximum capacity for a short burst of time, with cloud computing, you have the ability to kind of dynamically size how much physical hardware you need or virtual hardware that you need. Now, in terms of why somebody might specifically look to Azure as opposed to some of the other cloud providers out there, obviously one of the biggest reasons is the simple scalability and flexibility that Azure offers. You can, as I just described, you can dynamically scale the size of your cloud computing footprint based on the particular needs of the business at any one time. Additionally, and similarly to the previous point, paying for cloud computing services can be cheaper, especially if you only need to, say, purchase a slightly larger footprint for a short period of time, and then you can immediately scale it back down, versus having to go out and buy more hardware for one specific test and then have it not be used or needed for long periods of time. Again, as we've briefly touched on before, Azure also has great high availability and resiliency features that enable your software, your infrastructure, your environment to be very resilient to disasters by basically being able to move your physical servers and your services between different data centers and different locations, depending on the particular disaster that is being mitigated. Now, when it comes to kind of the specific offerings that Microsoft offers for its various types of cloud computing, there are four in particular that we're going to talk about here. So we're going to be talking about things called compute services, storage services, networking services, and database services. Each of these different categories of cloud computing all have specific functions and specific features that they enable depending on what your particular needs are. The most basic and common type of service category for Azure is what's called the service category, or the compute service. Basically, this category of cloud computing is what enables you to be able to create virtual machines within the cloud that you can then use to provide particular services to your network, whether we're talking about a DHCP server, a DNS server, a web server, whatever the case may be. To go along with that, we have these things called storage services. Now, in general, when you set up a compute service environment, you're going to get some of both the storage service offerings as well as the network or networking service categories, but they're going to be limited in terms of their particular capacity and what particular functions are going to be included. When you go out and physically purchase a storage service category offer, you're going to gain access to additional functionality that isn't available in the included bundle within the compute services category. Basically, when you buy a compute service offer, you're going to get some free options from some of the other categories: storage, networking, and database. However, if those particular free bundled options are not enough inside of your compute services offer, you have to go and purchase additional capacity, additional features through one of the various other categories that we've talked about. So the storage service category is all about storing data that can then be accessed from basically anywhere that is able to access the service. Usually, as long as you have an internet connection, you'll be able to access the data that is stored within the storage in the cloud. Oftentimes, you can think of the storage service offering as basically like a file server, but with several compatibility and feature upgrades over a standard file server. Similarly, for networking services, depending on your particular environment, your particular enterprise, the bundled offers or the bundled options inside of your compute services will likely be enough for single location enterprises. However, if you have multiple locations across your business and you wish to perhaps link those different locations together through Microsoft's back end, the networking service offers are going to allow you to make that sort of connection. Similarly, if you're running, say, a website, you're likely going to have to pay for the networking services offer that enables, say, for example, a static IP address. So the networking services category includes, again, those features that may not necessarily be strictly required for everybody, but most will want to take advantage of some of the options that are covered there. So we've already talked a little bit about each of the categories in the previous section. So this is basically just a quick summary of some of those particular features and options. Again, your compute services category is going to be all about setting up virtual machines and having them be accessible to your users, to your administrators via a standard internet connection at either the main office or their home office. Similarly, for data, we've talked a little bit about this as well, and I'm not going to go back through those details again, but once, just for reference purposes, the storage service category is all about data that is going to be stored in your cloud environment. Often, for at least from the user perspective, this is just going to function very similarly to a file server or a OneDrive share. There are some additional capabilities, particularly for, say, software purposes. You can store software you can have data that is stored inside of the cloud environment in a blob storage element, which is basically just a massive warehouse that is used primarily by, say, software to store and look up data. You could potentially also use something like this for, say, like video streaming would be a good example for where blob storage can be useful. So again, depending on your particular needs, if you require perhaps additional storage or storage with slightly more flavor to it, purchasing that storage service offer through Azure is a good way to enable some of those additional functions and features. And then, once again, for the connection of your compute services or to any kind of connection that you want to manage within or without of Azure, you are likely going to require some level of networking services be enabled, whether that is simply allowing an external party or an external customer to be able to reach your web server, whether you're talking about having multiple Azure instances within the cloud and you want to connect those together. The networking services offer is going to be what allows you to do that. And then the last section we're just going to very quickly touch on is the connection between some other Microsoft services and its Azure cloud environment. So Azure Cloud does enable access or does integrate well with things like Azure Active Directory. Anyone who has ever managed Active Directory, a local Active Directory through a domain controller will recognize a lot of the functionality has been replicated into the cloud version, which is Azure Active Directory. Additionally, you can specifically define role-based access control, which is basically providing, potentially down all the way to the user level, a custom list of permissions and access that they're able to achieve, rather than having to only provide access based on a singular job title. You can actually go down all the way to the user level and define a custom list of permissions for that specific user. Now, we briefly touched on the pricing and the cost of Azure as a cloud provider. And as I mentioned earlier, there are basically kind of two large categories when it comes to pricing. The first is the pay-as-you-go model, where you pay only for the active time or the active use of the cloud infrastructure. This tends to be more expensive long-term than using or buying simply blocks of time or blocks of service. If you simply only need cloud computing for a short window, a couple of weeks, maybe even a month, using pay-as-you-go can be or would be much cheaper. However, if you are likely to require access to the cloud environment for months or years, it is almost always going to be much more affordable to do that using a block-based access agreement. And this becomes even more true when you start looking at some of the discounts that can be made available, particularly for those longer commitment periods. Normally, these commitment periods last for anywhere between a year and 2 years, depending on the overall price. So, overall, Azure is a cloud-based computing platform, and it provides, through its baseline in virtualization, the ability to dynamically scale up or down the size of your cloud footprint. Azure can be both a less expensive or potentially a more expensive way to access the platform, depending on your particular needs and how much use you plan to make out of the infrastructure. So I'd like to thank everyone for watching our video. If you haven't seen any of our other videos on our channel, please go ahead and check some of those out. And we will see everyone in the next video.